my name is Emily. I work for Johnson's Nursery and I am a wholesale sales representative there. So I normally work on like the contractor side of things, but I love working with homeowners and stuff like that as well. So today I'm going to be going a little bit more into native plants. Such a great month to be doing that too, since it's Earth Month and tomorrow's Arbor Day. You know, we just got all the great holidays this month for it. So yeah, I'm just gonna get into it. So just a little bit of an overview. You know, I just kind of gave you a little bit about me, but before that, before working at Johnson's Nursery, I also worked at Native Roots, which is a native plant landscaping company. So I was there for 2 years as the maintenance crew leader there. So I did a lot of restoration work, even down to more like nitty-gritty maintenance, large-scale landscapes kind of stuff. And then for the presentation, I'm going to go over a couple different definitions that kind of come up a lot with native plants, just to keep us all on the same page in terms of what terminology we're going to be using. And then I'm going to go over some of my favorite native plants, and then I'm going to go over some different garden design tips with native plants specifically. So just kind of to start, like, why should we use native plants? Kind of the fun side of things is it's just an expansion of the plant palette that everyone already is using. So if you are someone that uses a lot of ornamental material, or maybe you're just feeling a little bored with your landscape and you want something new and interesting, native plants are a really good way to kind of change it up, because it's just not as common in our typical landscapes right now. A lot of people have also been coining this term sense of place, which is basically talking about selecting plants based on what we see in nature around where we live for your landscape, to kind of keep that kind of grounding in your landscape to the rest of the natural area. And then kind of the biggest part of it would be the food sources that it provides. So it provides so many food sources for a lot of our native insects, which obviously then benefits the food chain going upwards, which I'm going to get into a little bit more. So this is kind of the biggest concern as to why we should be using native plants. So especially with birds, about 80% of all bird species depend on insects as part of their diets, which a lot of people think of like the berries that are on the native plant, and that's what they're going to be eating, but this is where they get a lot of their protein sources. Especially with their young, that percentage rate goes up even higher, and 96% of all bird species depend on insects to feed their young. So if they don't have the food sources to then feed their young, how are their young going to like flourish and grow to be healthy bird species? And then 90% of all the birds that we have lost or have gone extinct in the last 50 years were ones that were insectivores and required insects to live. So if this is something that you kind of want to know more about, I would really recommend like Doug Tallamy's books. If you haven't checked them out, he goes way more in depth about this than I can, because he's an entomologist, so he's super knowledgeable about insects and stuff. And then this is just a graph that I found that kind of goes more in depth about the insect decline that we're seeing. So that top one is like pretty much all moth species, and then it kind of goes from there. And then the other big thing that a lot of people talk about is just in general, like the lack of knowledge that we have for insects. Insect research and like the community science projects hasn't really been a thing until recently. So there's this whole quarter, that gray quarter in that graph of just insects that we don't have enough knowledge on. So like, we don't know what their populations are like or what birds depend on those insects, just because we don't have enough information about them. So, take that into consideration with the other quarter that are vulnerable, endangered, or critically endangered. That only leaves us with less than 50% of the knowledge about our insect species that so many birds and the rest of the food chain need. So that's my kind of sad part of the conversation. Let's just gain a little knowledge. I hope that you learn at least something new today that you can maybe bring into your garden practices, a new plant, something fun like that. So just in general, what is considered a native plant? A plant is considered native if it's occurred naturally in your region, essentially. There's some like variable definitions, like gardener-wise, of like what people want in their landscape. Some people say, you know, I'm open to the whole Midwest region for native. Some people stick to Wisconsin native. That is kind of up to your discretion on how native do you want to go. And then host plant and nectar plant, especially if you're getting into, you know, doing pollinator patches, butterfly gardens, monarch way stations. This is a really good one to know. So host plants are basically all the plants that caterpillars and young insects need to survive, whereas nectar plants are the food source for those adult pollinators, and that's where they're going to get all of the stuff they need to survive. So in general, like the ideal habitat or garden is going to have a combination of both host plant and nectar plants so that you can, you know, have both the babies and the adults thriving in your garden. And then this is kind of some technical information. So again, like what is a cultivar? What are the different varieties that we can see of native plants? So when you're in a garden center and you're seeing something coined cultivar, that's basically something that's going to be a genetically modified plant, whether that be from cuttings or graftings or tissue culture. And obviously this is very common practice these days, from ornamental plants to natives to food crops. We are always doing different things to improve or change those plants. The main thing with that is that those cultivars, once they create seeds, they can turn and revert back to the other plant. So that's why sometimes you'll see like the reverting of coneflowers and stuff like that, because those have been modified in a lab, and so the seeds are going to have the original DNA of said plant. Whereas the varieties are going to be a natural change that can occur in nature. So those are where you'll see like the var in the Latin name. So one plant that is pretty common with that is like the white flowering eastern red buds. So you can see how it says like var alba to represent that it's a white variety of that plant. And those ones, if you were to collect the seeds of it and try to grow it yourself, it would grow white flowering. And this is kind of the side of cultivars that I think is really interesting with native plants, is there's a lot of opportunity for us to bring back plants that might have had disease issues in the past. So they're starting to do some American chestnut varieties that are hybrids with the Chinese version of it, and so it doesn't get all the issues that the American chestnut originally had. There's also been a lot of success with a lot of the elm tree varieties that are now Dutch elm disease resistant and are really popular as a street tree again, which is pretty cool. And then a lot of people, this is like the big talk of the town right now, is when will we have an EAB resistant ash tree? And then we would be able to bring back those trees that, you know, are so iconic as street trees and in the landscape. And then nativar is another term that gets thrown around a lot, which is essentially just a cultivar of a native plant. This is a pretty new thing, and so we're still in progress on researching, like, especially like how do the pollinators react to it? Is it as ecologically beneficial of the parent native plant? And so we're starting to get more research, and so far it's been looking pretty good. So one that I'm going to talk about a little bit is about a lot of the milkweed nativars, because those are one of my favorites, and I wanted to make sure that they still do the same great thing for monarch butterflies. So University of Kentucky, they made this test garden where they basically planted 6 of the native, and then they would plant the Nativar right next to it. And so they let those mature over 2 years, and then they did monarch larval surveying, and then they also tested the defensive characteristics of the plant, which is basically like what makes other insects not able to eat milkweed. And they found no difference in the success rates between monarch colonization. They did find that this white swamp milkweed that's all the way at the end there did have a little bit more of that defensive characteristic than the swamp milkweed, but it didn't seem like it was enough to stop the monarchs from using it. And then there's been some other researches. These ones that I'm kind of talking about for this one are also from Doug Tallamy. So some of the ones that can be a little bit problematic for insects are the ones that significantly change the leaf color, because then the insects just like don't respond to it as well, basically. They're just used to seeing green is the main thing. And so these like purple leaf 9-barks and stuff like that, you know, they're really pretty. But if your goal is to plant for pollinators, they're not going to be as ecologically beneficial as just like the straight common 9-bark. And then also the like double bloom coneflowers or anything like that. Sorry, I got distracted by the deer outside. The issue with those is like the insects can't really get into them as well to get at the nectar and pollen. So again, they're like great in the landscape here and there, but if your goal is for the plant or for the insects, just go with like the straight species coneflower. And then some other things to kind of consider when you're picking out native plants is like, what is the goal of your planting? I mean, and this is with any plants too, like, you know, if you're planting along your foundation or in the front of your house, you're not going to want to put like a 6-foot tall Joe Pye weed in the front of your house always, unless that's your style. So just kind of taking into consideration like, what is your goal with like your general landscape, as well as using native plants is pretty important. And then another thing with just pollinator gardening is focusing on having like flowering plants throughout the whole season. So am I having a flowering plant in May, June, July into October, because they need that consistent food like we all do, and also their life cycle is throughout the whole season, so they need that kind of variation throughout the season. And then just like a recommendation, Prairie Nursery does have, where if you're like searching through their plants, where you can search by bloom month. I did also just see like a really good chart from UW Extension for native plants for Wisconsin that went through like what month they were blooming. So both of those I would really recommend to kind of make sure that you're getting, you know, as many blooms as you can the whole season. And then this was a food source guide that I found from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that focused on the rusty patch bumblebee. And so this is basically what they recommend is 10 or more flowering plant species blooming throughout each portion of the season. And then they also talked about these superfood plants, which basically are plants where their nectar just has like extra nutrients for the insects, and so they are really desirable for just like everything that they need. And so that's the list that they recommended. So like bergamot, goldenrods, asters, hyssops, coneflowers, a lot of those like pretty common native plants can be really beneficial for bumblebees. And then milkweed species for a food monarch source, but they're also great for nectar because of the flowers that they have too. Another thing to consider is like our tension zone. Ozaukee County is actually in like a very, very cool spot of the tension zone. I'm sure you guys might know that. Where you guys get like all 3 areas of it. And so like, that's why like River Edge Nature Center is so cool, because it has so much diversity because you're in like all 3 spaces of the tension zone. So you guys really have the opportunity to kind of play around with all 3 tension zone plants, which is awesome. And then another thing to just kind of like put in the back of your noggin is there are some new invasive species that are going to be banned by the DNR pretty soon. Some of these might already be on that list, or I know are in talks of it. So burning bush, they are planning on even banning like the 1 compacta variety, which would basically make burning bush not allowed in the state of Wisconsin. You can still have it in your garden, but you're not going to find it in garden centers anymore. Same with Japanese barberry, and then Callery pear. And Norway maple has been on its way out for a little bit now. I'm not sure when the exact cutoff date is. So like another thing just from like the nursery perspective is the DNR essentially gives all nurseries like 5 years to clear out their stock of these plants. So that's why like they might still be at some garden centers. Like we've decided to stop bringing in burning bush and Japanese barberry as of this year, just because we saw that the DNR was going to be banning all of them. We still do have some stock just because we have them in our fields, because we probably had to plant them 5 or 6 years ago before we had learned that they were going to become this invasive plant. So you'll still see that at a lot of places for the next couple years, but I would recommend moving away from them and kind of trying to find some good substitutes. So if you're having a hard time with that, you can always contact our retail department. And we have some blog posts on our website now for subs as well. Now we're getting into the plant part. So I just wanted to start off initially with oak trees. Really, any oak tree that you choose to plant in your garden is going to be a great option as a host plant. Oak trees are host plants to 436 caterpillar species. So I always tell people, if you don't really want to do anything else, plant an oak tree, because you're going to help over 400 species of insects just by planting an oak tree. One thing to take into consideration is because of our clay-heavy soils here, red oak and white oak don't really like the alkaline, and so like I would recommend like this Quercus shootii, which is a swamp burr hybrid, which is kind of different and cool, and it can do the alkaline soils really well. Swamp white oak is still okay too, and then bur oak, of course, too. Another like kind of basic shade tree that's really great for pollinators is hackberry. So I really like hackberry because it's got that really interesting bark texture that really provides some winter interest once, you know, nothing else is happening. They do have a really nice yellow fall color. You know, it's kind of great with everything else. And then they get these small berries that a lot of the butterflies really like, or not butterflies, the birds really like eating them in the fall. And then it is the host plant to several different kinds of butterflies as well. And I know at least like one of these is considered endangered. Another really great pollinator tree is basswood. I'm sure you guys have seen in the grocery store like basswood honey, because it has a really sweet scent and just flavor and is wonderful. So it can be called the American linden, or some people even call it bee tree because of how much the bees love it. The songbirds will eat the seeds, so it's another good bird plant. It doesn't love drier soils, so if you can plant it in, you know, really besides dry soils, it can pretty much go anywhere else. Another kind of cool ornamental shrub tree is common witch hazel. This one's really cool because it blooms super late, like October into November, so it's a really good late nectar source. The branching on it is just really cool, so I love it as like using it as an ornamental kind of tree, like instead of a crabapple or something like that. And then it's just like a little different because it's not gonna bloom when like everyone else's trees are blooming, which is kind of cool. And then the seed pods on it will burst open and they will shoot like 12 feet in all directions. So it's just like a really interesting tree in that way. One of my coworkers actually, I don't know if Mike Yanni has come to talk to you guys, but he will do this this talk with little kids, and he dresses up as a squirrel and is seed man, and he takes a bunch of the seed pods and he brings them and he has the kids shoot them, and they shoot like everywhere. So it's just kind of a cool plant because of it. And then it is also a host plant for the spring azure butterfly, so it's a host plant option as well. Blazing stars are just like my absolute favorite ever. So they are such a great nectar source. I mean, they're just like so beautiful. They're such an eye-catching plant in your garden because they're just spiky and like different from everything else. If you have full sun, like they can do pretty much any soil type, any dry, wet. It'll be happy as long as it's getting full sun. There's a couple different varieties of it. All varieties are great. There is one Nativar that I also really like that's called Cobalt Blazing Star, that it's just like a little bit more dense, because sometimes if these guys are like totally by themselves in the landscape, they'll kind of flop a little bit. So that's just like something to prepare for. Maybe put it more like center in your bed so it has that space to kind of, do what it wants to do. And then it's also a really great butterfly bush alternative. We're not seeing it as much here, but butterfly bush is considered invasive down in Illinois, so there's some limitations on that too. And it has really similar, purple flowers, so it's a pretty good alternative for that. Buttonbush is another shrub that I really love. It does get pretty large, so you kind of got to take into consideration that. It would be really cool as like a hedging native shrub, because it does get like 8 to 12 feet tall, and the branches, you can kind of see it better in this picture, they kind of like hang, and so it just kind of gives it this like cool form as like a hedge option. And then, I mean, the flowers are really unique, these like little white balls that it gets. It does prefer wetter soils, so that's just something to take into consideration. Several Leodoptera, which are primarily moth species, use it as host plants too, so that's another great host plant option. And then a lot of the birds also eat the seeds. There are also Nativar options of this that are a little bit dwarfier, more like 5 to 6 foot. So if you're really loving this plant but you don't really have the space for it, you could go with one of the Nativar options that's just like a little bit more compact. Joe Pye weed. I love this plant. I mean, I love all these plants. But this one's a really great nectar source. It does get really tall, so it would be a cool like back of the bed plant, kind of hanging out back there. It has these really great pink flowers. In the fall, you'll see like that one, the leaves turn a little bit more neon before they like turn yellow for fall. It blooms in July and August, and then there is also another variety that's purpureum that handles the shade better than this one does. So if you're wanting this plant in a shady location, just go with that variety. Serviceberry is another wonderful plant that I really like. This one is really great for both birds and pollinators. This is a really great sub for calorie pear if you're really wanting that white spring feel in your garden. They're also become a more popular foraging fruit. Sometimes you hear the fruit called Juneberry versus serviceberry. So like, I know one of my coworkers that's really into fruits makes like jams and wines and baked goods with them. But he always says if you can get them before the birds, because the birds do get to them very quickly. Foxglove beard tongue is another really cool plant. This one blooms like May or June, so it's kind of on the earlier side, which is nice. A lot of people are pretty familiar with the Dark Towers Nativar of this plant, which is another really popular one that I like. This one is more just a nectar source. The bumblebees like it, hummingbirds and mason bees. It's kind of cool if you're in your garden and you watch. The bumblebees will like fully climb into these little flowers, so you just see their butts sticking out of them as they're getting all the pollen, and they come out and they're all covered in pollen and just confused. So it's just kind of a fun plant to have. And then these are some pictures of the Dark Towers variety. So like, I mean, those seed pods are so cool, that super dark red color. And then it keeps that purpley red foliage all season. So just like, kind of cool. Lupin is a great one. This one is a little tricky to get going here just because it typically does prefer sandy soils, but I did just want to bring it up because it is the host plant for Karner blue butterfly, which is an endangered butterfly in the state of Wisconsin. Currently, it's not really in... Thank you. Currently, it's not in this area of the state, but historically it was. So that's where I think it could be a cool option to start introducing this, and hopefully their populations take off and they start to go into where their whole original, habitat was. For this one though, I would avoid the Nativars because the Nativars are typically made out of the western variety of lupin, and the western variety has actually been seen to be invasive on the East Coast. It hasn't moved into this area for invasive tendencies, but it can just get really aggressive in your garden, and it doesn't really have the same ecological benefits as the just straight wild lupin does for Karner blue butterfly. So this one I would stick to just the straight species. Culver's root is another one that I think is super cool, and this one's a little less common, I feel like. Yeah, it has these super cool, like, white, it's just so cool, sorry. And this one I always see just like covered in pollinators when I've seen it in the prairie. Bumblebees just go absolutely crazy for it. It does prefer like a medium to wetter soil, and there's a lot of really cool nativars about this one. And so, kind of a side tangent about the nativars of this one. There's one called Fascination Culver's root, and that one they've done research on, and it's actually been deemed better than the native one because of how it has a longer bloom time. And so because it has a longer bloom time, it has a longer period of time that it can be a nectar source for the bumblebees. So that's kind of cool. We haven't really seen that before with other nativars. So, and it has a little bit more of like a light dusty pink color. So it's really gorgeous. This, the cultivars are a little bit difficult to source. I think we're gonna have the Fascination this year, and it's the first year that we've been able to find it and carry it. So I'm probably gonna get it and try it. Mountain mint is another really popular one. This one is like really high on the list for rusty patch bumblebees, if that is something that you want to kind of cater your garden towards. It's a really great nectar source. It likes the wetter soils as well, and it blooms pretty late. It blooms kind of into September, right before the goldenrods start to bloom. Wild bergamot is a very popular one. I'm sure a lot of you guys might already have this in your garden, but I just wanted to bring up that it is a host plant, which I wasn't familiar with. I was just, thought the bees loved it. It's really abundant in its range, so if you have like a friend that can, give you some seeds, it does do pretty well seeding it in your garden. And it does go by a lot of names, but it's pretty much all the same plant. There's a couple different kinds of varieties that are being, brought more to the Midwest, more too. There is a Bradbury bergamot, that's the eastern bee balm, basically. And then there's also the spotted bee balm, which I really like. That looks a little bit different and does better in like a drier condition, but all of them have really similar ecological benefits. Annie's hyssop. This one's really cool because I see this one primarily as more of a bird perennial. I always see like the goldfinches, like they will stand on top of mine and like pluck the seeds out of it, which is really cool in like the fall when normally like you'll see them go after thistle and stuff. So I like this one like primarily for the goldfinches. It does bloom later and it does attract hummingbirds and butterflies, but I really think it attracts the birds more, if anything. caterpillar, so you'll get the really crazy looking stripy guys on it, but they're super cool looking. One thing is just to not mistake it with wild parsnip. It blooms quite a bit later. Wild parsnip does, it blooms more in like July and is quite a bit taller, where this plant would stay more like here and starts blooming probably early June. It is like pretty bushy, as you can kind of see. Like I planted this right at the front of my garden, and it will just kind of flop over my edge, which I mean is okay, but it's a little chaotic. So this one would almost be cooler to plant as like a shrub kind of, because it just stays so round. So it's just a good kind of foliage plant, or like how you would plant a hosta, you know. Northern sea oats is another really cool one. This one is technically not native to Wisconsin, but it's native to Illinois, so do with that what you will. It does prefer some shadier locations, which is kind of a plus because it's hard to find grasses that will do really well in shady areas for natives. I mean, the fall interest is just like gorgeous on it. A lot of people that do like flower bouquets like to use this plant in it. And several Leobdatra also use this plant as a host plant. Meadow anemone is a really cool flowering ground cover native plant. Normally, I would recommend pairing it with larger perennials just because this one will spread. It spreads by rhizomes. It behaves with larger perennials, but if you have some really short ones in it, it might kind of take over and shade those guys out. The deer do not like this one, so that's another perk. And it blooms like late May, early June, so it's a really pretty like early blooming ground cover. And again, there's quite a few ground covers that are considered invasive too, so finding some good native options is really great. And then any kind of milkweed that you can put in your garden is great. The three really common ones that people put in are swamp, common, and butterfly weed. There's a couple other funkier varieties too. If you really go down the native plant rabbit hole, there's like rolled milkweed. There's a cool showy milkweed that looks like common but isn't quite as aggressive. So any of these are excellent options. And then little blue stem I really love. I love its fall color. The bumblebees do need bunch grasses because they will actually which some of you might have experienced this in your garden, in the winter when these all flop over, they'll nest kind of within these bunch grasses throughout the season. So that's how they kind of hibernate throughout the winter here. And then they'll eventually come out, typically move their nest somewhere else. So it's pretty essential for like their habitat and life cycle. And then going over some of the garden design stuff. So this is a picture of the propagator that works at Johnson's, his front yard. As you can tell, he is a total plant nerd too. So these are just some things that I would recommend if you're really, in a subdivision, stuff like that. Is keeping a really solid edge on your native plantings can be really helpful because, you might get like the comment of like, oh, it looks like weeds, But if you have a solid edge or any way that you can basically make it look like it's landscaped. A lot of people had put in those native plant signs, like I'm creating pollinator habitat. I think any of those ways that you can just kind of like make it look more landscaped is really gonna kind of like help that argument, I guess. And then again, kind of trying to keep short prairie plants in the front because HOAs can have some height restrictions, that kind of stuff. So it just kind of helps to make everyone happy. And then this list on the side is just a couple of the plants that I could kind of readily see that he has in his landscape. So, shooting star prairie drop seed. A lot of that stuff is relatively short, under, like 3 feet in height. Kind of a cool spot that I really like of his landscape is this picture all the way at the end, how he's used some, stone to just kind of throw it in to make a little microhabitat for his prickly pear cactuses, which I think is super unique because they normally don't love the clay soils either. And that is our only native cactus, so pretty cool. He's got a lot of common milkweed kind of going on, which, you can always, like, once they flower, kind of trim some of them back if you're feeling like they're going a little too crazy. And then this one's got some lead plant, which lead plant is like the only true prairie shrub, which is kind of cool. And then just like a lot of grasses. Like he said prairie dropseed is the essential plant in his landscape. And then here's a farther out picture of later in the season too. So just kind of cool. Like that first picture I showed you guys was probably in like late May, early June, and like seeing how much it evolves through the season is just like really unique because you just kind of like, it just changes throughout the whole season. It's kind of cool. And then another thing that I just wanted to talk about was like, he's got this little short space in the front where you can kind of clearly see that, it's a work in progress. He's moving some stuff forward. He's clearly expanding out his bed, which I think is really great. You don't have to do it all at once. I think a lot of people get really excited and are like, let's rip out the whole landscape. But, doing it in steps can, you can get a really beautiful landscape that way because you can maintain it. This is another example that I found from one of our landscapers of just like a general bird nativar back garden that I thought was really cute. So, they used a red bee balm variety, which is a really great nativar. The red kind of helps to attract some more hummingbirds to that one, which is kind of cool. The butterfly weed that's in the corner is really a big statement plant. There's some smaller indigo that's in there. Sedum isn't a native plant, but it's a really great pollinator plant, so I think that that's a good one to have mixed in some spots. I just thought this was really great. Having some shorter plants around the birdhouse can be really helpful because cats will hide if you have a stray cat problem in your neighborhood, like I do because I'm in Milwaukee. So having shorter plants around it, doesn't give predators the opportunity to hide underneath your birdhouse. And then I just really liked how they had this kind of all in front of the fence, so it just kind of gave it a more complete look. And then this was just an example of like a front yard planting that one of our designers did. So they went a little bit more basic, but it looks really beautiful for a front planting. So, they did a lot of black-eyed Susan. In the back there is a weeping Canadian hemlock. So a weeping native conifer option, which is pretty sweet. Those grasses I wouldn't recommend personally. I'd probably do like big blue stem or Indian grass if you're wanting something tall and different, but I'm pretty sure that's a miscanthus variety, which those are also kind of starting to be invasive. I also really liked that they had a pathway in it, so it just made it feel, structured. The gazebo, just, you can walk through it. It just makes it feel really complete. And then another really awesome example that I saw recently, so Kelly Norris, I would really recommend his book, or he's pretty active on social media because he does a lot of nativar design work. And so he had a client that had this really big hill next to a sidewalk, and she was like, I'm sick of mowing this. It sucks. And so they made it into this really beautiful prairie because they have a lot of dog walkers that go through there and all that stuff. So, he's got the dark towers penstemon that we talked about earlier, the purple coneflower. Those little yellow ones in the back are a coreopsis, which is another really great one. Some blazing star mixed into there, and then a lot of grasses. So in general, it's not that was like 5 plants that I just listed off, but the way that he did it just made it really beautiful, which I think is really cool. It doesn't have to be like 80 billion plants to make something beautiful. And then I just wanted to go into kind of like the more restoration style a little bit. These pictures are from Lakeshore State Park. So again, kind of like I said earlier, like my biggest recommendation is to start small. Start where you feel like you can handle that maintenance, because especially like the first 3 years of starting a native landscape, it's gonna be a lot more maintenance as the plants get really established. There's kind of 2 ways to start. You can either smother an area with a tarp, like put it down in the fall, let it sit there over winter, kill the grass, and then plant into it. Or if you're comfortable using herbicide, you could spray an area and go that way. For restoration style, that is where I would recommend really only using straight species, just because that's where we just like really don't know like how the nativars are gonna interact with all the other plants. Like there's concern about like hybridizing with the straight species and stuff like that. So that's just kind of, just stick with the straight species if you're trying to do a prairie style. Some plants can be a little bit more challenging to seed than others, especially like shade plants, ferns, like that kind of stuff. So some of that stuff might be good to add like some quartz and plugs into it if you are choosing to do seeding. And then again, just like prepare for it to take a little time if you are gonna go that route. Using a cover crop like Canada Wild Rye can be really great to avoid weeding in that, or not weeding, weeds during that process. And then also, you know, reach out, get involved, ask questions. You know, groups like this are really great for native planting, planting in general, to, you know, get all your questions answered. And then briefly kind of on herbicide, it is a really great gardening tool, but it's not the only one. So there's a couple different ways that you can handle invasives in your yards. You can snip off flower heads if you're kind of wanting to avoid spraying, because a lot of invasives are biennials, meaning that they have a 2-year period and then they'll die, but they seed really well, and so that's how they keep surviving in our gardens. So if you snip off the flower head prior to spraying, at least that's going to stop it from spreading, so that can help. And then some plants can be really, you can just hand pull them. There are some plants that really require like spraying, like reed canary grass or purple loosestrife. Another thing that's kind of like good to think about with native plants is neonicotinoids. So neonicotinoids are an insecticide that's commonly used in the nursery trade for pest issues. We use it even in some of our 25 oaks because of the 2-line chestnut borer that they can get, which will basically just like kill your oak tree. So they're good for certain things, not good for other things, and a lot of people use them way too much. So it can even be used as a seed coating. It's not permanent though. It typically fully leaves the tree after like 3 years, and normally it's like minor enough after 2 years that it's not going to like affect the insects anymore. These are some of the nurseries that I would recommend around here. A lot of these do like plug sizes where you can order it online and they'll ship to your house. If you're looking for larger size natives, we carry a lot of 1 gallon and up, so if you're looking kind of for that instant gratification of your plants, then I would recommend coming to us. And then these are just some of my favorite resources for when I kind of initially got into native plants. Neil DeBoll is an excellent resource. All the Doug Tallamy resources are really great. Heather Holm is really cool because she does come from the insect side a little bit more. I do actually have a copy of her book here if people just wanted to browse it. I wasn't sure how much time we had, but she just has like a lot of guides and plant lists in the back of this too, which I think is super helpful. This one is really cool because I feel like moths do not get the amount of representation that they deserve. And so this goes over so many moth species like that I had never even heard of. plants from. It's really awesome. I just recently got this book. The Prairie Pod, I don't know if any of you guys are into podcasts, but that's a podcast that the Minnesota DNR does. So they have a lot of different restoration ecologists, botanists, that kind of stuff on there. And then we also have a knowledge-based section of the website on Johnson's Nursery. So a lot of our horticulturists throughout the years have written a lot of different blog posts about different native plants. No, I wanted to end with some more plant pictures. So I don't know if you guys have ever made it out to the Monarch Trail that is in Wauwatosa. There's a friends group that's Friends of the Monarch Trail. I was like the land steward here for a few years, and it's just kind of a beautiful secret place in Wauwatosa. So there are some pictures of a peak bloom.